This is our March meeting of the Urban Ecology Collaborative. Welcome, and we'll let people join. If you're just joining, feel free to go into the chat and put your name, where you're calling in from, maybe your organization, and anything you're excited about for Arbor Day. We are getting very excited about Arbor Day coming up on April 26th in New England, so we'd love to hear what everyone else has going on. And I'll do our little spiel for the Urban Ecology Collaborative. So welcome. We're a group of groups. We are focused in the New England and Mid-Atlantic regions. We meet once a month on the third Wednesday of each month at 10 a.m. and we discuss urban forestry, urban ecology, and related topics. We have a Google group forum for sharing about upcoming events, research, jobs, and other things. And that's usually a pretty lively group. We recently had some discussion about graffiti on trees, so you never know what you're going to hear about through the UEC group. And we've got our co-chairs here today. My name is Erica Holm. I'm from Boston and I work at Mass Audubon. And we've got Clara Katongo at Tree Pittsburgh, who's doing our recording today. And today we have, we're really excited to have Mia Wavrek, I think I'm pronouncing that correct, maybe, from the USGS ORISE research participant in urban ecology and native plants with the USGS National Climate Adaptation Science Centers. And I'll let Mia do most of her own introduction. But normally what we do is we ask people for any community updates that they'd like to give at the beginning of the meeting before we invite our speaker to start sharing. So does anybody have anything that's that they really want to share with the UEC this month? Go ahead, Clara.
So I'm actually at Tree Pittsburgh. We are hiring for a couple of positions, but my department is hiring for a community engagement coordinator. I'll send that in the email, but I figured I'll just say it here so that it's in the recording. We are still hiring, and if you know any cool people who love to be out on the streets knocking on doors, but also do some analysis and community engagement, send them my way. That's my main update.
That's so exciting. I definitely have seen that job posting and encourage everyone to share it out. For anybody who's just joining, we are just in our community updates kind of section. So UEC March meeting, I saw some new people joining. And if anybody had anything that they really wanted to share before we invite our speaker, raise your hand or just start speaking and we'll have those community updates now.
Hey everybody, sorry, I'm trying to go on our website, and I'll post this in the chat. American Forest has an upcoming Growing Careers webinar about workforce development. Anybody is welcome, whether you're new or not. It's going to be on March 28th.
Awesome, and we'll send the links out in our follow-up email too. Great to see you, Becky. I am seeing in the chat someone from Austin, Texas has joined us. Welcome. That's so exciting. And they celebrate Arbor Day in the fall, which is actually really awesome and interesting. There's a couple of towns here in Massachusetts that also do a fall Arbor Day rather than a spring. So it's good to just keep in mind that you can celebrate Arbor Day at multiple times of year. All right, I think that marks our end of our community updates. Again, if you still have something that you'd like to share, you can do that in the Google group or put it in the chat and we'll send it out in our follow-up email. And yeah, we sometimes will read our presenter's bio. So let me go forward with that. So today we have Mia Wavrek, she, hers, and she is in ORISE, so Oak Ridge, I think it's Institute of Science Research Education, something like that. Research participant in urban ecology and native plants with the USGS National Climate Adaptation Science Centers, or CASCs. In this role, Mia supports the development of an urban research priority and is a core member of the CASC's DEIA, so Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Access team, where she is involved in the development and implementation of the CASC DEIA strategic plan. Her research focuses on climate impacts to native plants with an emphasis on climate resilient species in support of Lepidoptera and specialist bees. And today Mia will be talking about the CASC's partnership-driven program. So Mia, I'd welcome you to share your screen and let us know what you're up to. We're super excited to hear from you.
Thanks so much, Erica and Clara, for inviting me. I'm super excited to be here. Can I get a thumbs up that you can see the screen? Okay, and my speaker notes didn't block anything, right? Okay, great. Thanks, awesome. So, yep, again, my name is Mia Wavrek. My pronouns are she, hers. I am a white woman with dark brown hair, wearing a dark shirt in front of a blank white wall. And I am really excited to be here today to talk about the USGS Climate Adaptation Science Centers and the work that they are doing on urban climate adaptation. So for the next 30 or so minutes, I'll provide a little bit more background about myself before I get into who the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, or CASCs, are. I'll talk about CASC research and the identification of the urban research priority, and then some of the development of the research agenda and some of the key milestones along the way. And I am super excited to highlight the upcoming Urban Climate Adaptation Symposium that's happening. It's a virtual symposium, and I'll be sure to drop some of the information in the chat at the end after I give my spiel about the Urban Symposium. So a little bit of background about me. I'm a first-generation college graduate. I got my Bachelor's of Science in Ecology and Evolution from the University of Pittsburgh. And during my undergrad, I studied a variety of different ecological and evolutionary questions related mostly to plant systems and eastern temperate forest ecosystems. So that ranged anywhere from the evolution of separate sexes in plants to impacts of deer overabundance and invasive species on native understory perennials. From there, very non-linearly, I found my way to the University of Tennessee, where I got a master's in geology, but my thesis work really focused on both ecological and social science questions related to urban forested natural areas. So I used both social survey methods and traditional ecological sampling methods, as well as drone remote sensing to explore areas of conservation interest and concern in urban forests throughout the Knoxville region. And then currently, I'm an ORISE research participant in ecology, urban ecology and native plants with the National and Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Centers. So for those who aren't familiar with the ORISE program, it stands for Oak Ridge Institute for Science and Education. It is an early career development program that provides opportunities for recent graduates to partner with a federal mentor at federal agencies. A variety of different federal agencies are involved. And it has been a great opportunity for me to then kind of expand on some of those impacts to plants that I talked about earlier and focus more on some of the climate impacts, as well as a bunch of other things that I'll share today. So considering that a lot of the jargon and the program at the Climate Adaptation Science Center is a federal program, I thought it might be helpful to kind of contextualize the Climate Adaptation Science Centers. So there's a National Climate Adaptation Science Center based in DC, and then 9 regional science centers. The program is part of the ecosystem mission area of the U.S. Geological Survey, which is kind of the science bureau of the federal government. And other bureaus within the Department of Interior that the CASC program regularly partners with include the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Park Service, as well as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. There's also ample opportunities for collaboration across other federal departments, including the Department of Agriculture, which of course houses the U.S. Forest Service program. The Department of Commerce houses the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association that has a bunch of climate research. So we're really excited to be exploring these other partnerships through other federal urban programs. One of the really unique things about the CASC program is that it's a university federal partnership. So each region is comprised of a suite of universities that periodically recompete for a spot on that regional consortium. So most of these consortia are university institutions, but there is collaboration. For example, in the Northeast region, the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station is part of the Northeast Consortium. And in the Midwest, there's collaboration with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. So other resource management, sometimes NGO, non-governmental organizations as well. So to kind of get into the scope of the CASC's work and research, the mission of the CASC is to deliver science to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. And the CASC do this by providing resource managers and other partners with the scientific information and decision-making tools that they need to understand and adapt to the effects of climate change on wildlife and habitats. They also collaborate with managers and scientists from a variety of different sectors. So this includes state, other federal agencies, tribal nations, indigenous communities, other universities, and NGOs to address the science needs of those partners and then inform adaptation planning. And the CASC network really places an emphasis on generating actionable science, which is information to support resource management decisions, actions, and plans on the ground. So really focused on using the information that's produced. So I wanted to provide some examples of the kind of research projects that come out of the CASC program to contextualize how the urban program was developed. This project, led by Michael Notaro at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, was based in the Great Lakes region, and it explored how increasing winter temperatures have affected winter ice cover, which impacts deer and waterfowl distributions, which are popular game species in the Great Lakes. And with the long-term projections of winter severity and snowpack and lake ice that were generated from the project, the managers have a foundation for estimating future distributions of wildlife and can start planning now for expected changes in the future. In Alaska, glaciers are melting faster than glaciers almost anywhere else. So this project, led by Eran Hood at the University of Alaska Southeast, explored how this glacial melt is impacting Alaska's coastal ecosystems, which happen to be some of the most productive marine ecosystems on Earth. The data from this project can inform several high-priority glacier influence management issues in the Gulf Alaska region. That includes anything from tourism, viewshed evolution, and habitat conservation and restoration for important species like salmon. This is a Southeast CASC project that was led by Nick Haddad at North Carolina State University, and it identified how important wildlife habitat connections across the Southeast region might be impacted by changes in climate and in urban growth. So habitat connectivity is a strategy often used for conserving wildlife, but it can be challenging in really highly developed regions. So the result of this study can be used by managers and regional landscape planners to help determine where conservation efforts and resources should be focused in order to maintain connectivity for these important species into the future. Considering drought, this project explored drought impacts on the Wind River Indian Reservation, and it was led by Cody Knutson at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. On the reservation, the Wind River Water Code identified 15 key uses for water, ranging from agriculture to fisheries to cultural ceremonies. And to improve the drought preparedness on the reservations, the research team were working with tribal water and resource managers to help to develop a reservation-wide drought management plan. It summarizes the drought indicator information for each season, and the drought summaries are already helping the reservation to make informed water allocation decisions used by community members to identify drought throughout the reservation. And one final example of sea level rise, which results in chronic erosion on many Hawaiian beaches. This team was led by Charles Fletcher at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, which modeled beach response to rising sea level over the next century to generate data and maps of erosion hazard areas on the island of Kauai. So the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources, as well as local planning departments and other coastal management agencies, can use the project's data and maps for hazard preparedness and adaptation planning on state and local scales. So you might have noticed that when going through these research highlights, there was not many mentions of urban environments or studies that really took place in urban areas. But as this audience is well aware, the ecosystems in and around urban centers harbor a wide diversity of natural and cultural resources that are worthy of investigation and of investments. And the resources and the people that use and benefit from these natural and cultural resources face interacting stressors of climate and human development. So many of us are familiar with these, like urban heat island effects, increased flooding, which make urban environments particularly vulnerable to climate change and in high need of climate adaptation research. And it wasn't until recently that there has been a more concerted effort to explore mission-aligned opportunities in urban environments for the CASC network. So in 2020, this effort began during a meeting with both federal CASC staff and university staff that focused on issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility across the CASC network. And this led to the identification of the urban research priority area for several reasons, some of which I've already mentioned. So they're understudied relative to predominantly natural landscapes. They experience interacting stressors of climate and the built environment. But they also tend to be places where large inequities are concentrated. So this map on the right shows in thicker, bold red outlining neighborhoods that were historically redlined in the city of Richmond, but this is the case in many cities across the US. And these neighborhoods tend to be areas that have reduced canopy cover, higher impervious surfaces, tend to coincide with predominantly minority populations and lower income populations that then face the climate impacts of increased heat and flooding, compared to non-historically redlined neighborhoods that coincide with wealthier and predominantly white areas that are also cooler with greater canopy cover and therefore more climate resilient on a local scale. So this lack of associated benefits of research investment in urban areas, because they aren't a priority for, or historically haven't been a priority for conservation researchers, is an environmental justice concern, given that these areas are highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and in high need of climate adaptation research. So upon identifying the urban research priority area, it was formalized with the purpose of really addressing a gap in climate adaptation science in urban and urbanizing areas with a few desired outcomes. Not only to advance climate adaptation in these environments, but also, like I had previously mentioned, advance equity in climate adaptation science and in the CASC program's delivery. And given that these are federal, this is a federal program that is intended to serve the American public, it also improves the execution of the CASC and DOI missions, considering over 80% of the American public live in urban areas. So here provides kind of a high-level overview of some of the key milestones to date for the CASC Urban Research Priority. As I mentioned, in 2020, there was the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility meeting that led to the identification of the priority area. And from there, a cross-CASC, so multi-region, federal and university members formed a working group focused on this effort. And those early efforts really focused on developing a national urban issues paper that outlined key mission-aligned research areas for the CASC as it related to urban environments, but also started to explore some other federal programs in this area that the CASC program could add value to, and developed an initial list of some existing urban research projects. In 2021, a regional working group was formed between the Northeast and the Southeast CASCs, given some existing urban partnerships in those regions, and also the larger urban landscape in those regions. And at that time, dedicated capacity was added in the form of an ORISE fellow, which is when I joined this project. So in early 2020, really the focus of my early work was to scope the federal programs, identify additional urban programs to really see where areas of collaboration could be furthered. And from that effort, there were regional scoping conversations in the Northeast and Southeast with some of the partners identified in that federal regional scoping. At that time, the urban research priority area was more formally incorporated into the CASC Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility strategy, which is kind of where some of the overlap of the urban work that I was doing and the diversity and equity work that I have since been more involved in began. And one of the goals of the CASC DEIA strategy is to advance equity in CASC investments, partly by collaborating more closely with underserved communities. So that also includes underserved urban communities. Last year, some of the priorities that were identified in the regional scoping conversations were incorporated into CASC regional science plans and regional project solicitation documents, which then encouraged the principal investigators in those regions to identify areas of intersection with the work that they're doing, and also identify unique partners in urban areas. At that time, we also started developing the Urban Climate Adaptation Virtual Symposium that I'll talk a bit more about. That's happening in about 2 weeks from now. And in mid-May, we'll be hosting a similar panel on urban climate adaptation at the National Adaptation Forum in St. Paul. So I want to dig into a few of the items that I mentioned in this kind of high-level overview, one of which are the federal urban programs that were scoped through the initial scoping effort. So probably one of the most robust urban programs across federal agencies is the Urban Waters Federal Partnership. It's a partnership of 15 federal agencies in collaboration with NGOs, local officials, and community-based organizations that improve the benefits of urban waterways. Within the USGS, there's no real formal overarching urban program, but there are some unique efforts across the various mission areas. So the hazards mission area has an urban seismic hazards focus group. The water mission areas has an urban landscapes capability team that are focused on a variety of urban water issues. And of course, the climate adaptation science centers are focused on urban natural and cultural resources and climate adaptation. And within the DOI, the Fish and Wildlife Service has a really robust urban conservation program that improves access to nature for people in and near cities through their National Urban Wildlife Refuges program and federal local urban refuge partnerships. So if folks are familiar with the urban bird treaty cities, the Fish and Wildlife Service is involved in that through their urban conservation program. The scoping efforts for the National Park Service have kind of been on pause since the push for the Urban Climate Adaptation Virtual Symposium. But so it's been a little while since I followed up on this, but and I'd be curious to know if anyone in this audience knows more about the urban efforts with the National Park Service. But in 2015, they launched an urban agenda and an urban fellows program that had some really cool initial outputs, but there seemed to be on pause, but definitely opportunity for further collaboration. And then, of course, in other non-Department of Interior programs like the Urban and Community Forestry Program with the Forest Service that has been providing science and decision tools to inform stewardship of urban trees and forests is definitely an ample opportunity for further collaboration, including some other programs like the Urban Integrated Field Laboratories and Consortium for Climate Risk in the Urban Northeast were also identified. I had mentioned the development of an urban issues paper. One of the key items developed with that effort were mission-aligned urban research themes, some of which are included here on the slide, along with some suggested research areas. So exploring things like temperature-induced changes or flood patterns within urban ecosystems, and how biodiversity is adapting to those changes in the context of climate. Urban ecosystems and biodiversity as part of a larger landscape matrix. So I had mentioned before some of the landscape connectivity work that the CASC are doing, and considering updating urban growth projections to really consider some of the connectivity components for climate adaptation as species shift their ranges in response to climate change. Fire and the wildland urban interface is another area that is the CASC is well positioned to address as it relates to adaptation for natural hazards and extreme events, but also nature-based solutions and exploring some of the co-benefits to urban residents and urban wildlife and habitats. And then finally, ecosystem and cultural services could include anything from urban subsistence lifestyles like urban fishing and foraging, and also exploring further co-benefits of the ecosystem services to different climate adaptation strategies. Another effort that I had mentioned as part of defining the urban priority area was compiling examples of CASC-funded projects that were addressing urban climate adaptation needs. So I wanted to share a few of the examples of those projects. This one was led by Southwest CASC PI Glenn McDonald and colleagues, and they explored how drought can decrease vegetation health and limit its cooling effect. So the results of this project suggested that economically disadvantaged areas had vegetation that was more sensitive to drought, which was likely linked to inequality in water use. So these populations experience a lower degree of vegetation cooling effects and higher exposure to heat waves, which imply that the potential of a community's vegetation in mitigating heat waves is significantly influenced by the socioeconomic status of the community. Climate change in the Northwest is causing warmer summer stream flows that can really impact cold water species of great significance like salmon. But there has been little assessment kind of at the source of how these warmer stream flows are occurring. So how urban warming or cooling by shade trees, for example, affects curbside runoff temperatures from streets to storm drains was not very well understood. So this research project was led by Northwest CASC PI Kevin Moffitt, who found that this warm summer runoff might be cooled at its source with small adaptations in urban forestry, although with important unanticipated trade-offs between managing those street tree canopies and the amount. And this sort of runoff temperature mitigation strategy of street trees is now being incorporated into some predictive modules to add to the types of cost benefit analyses for trees that are used by city planners and managers when considering urban greening impacts on local and downstream waters and ecosystems. And this final urban project example is a collaboration with a suite of stakeholders, including the Fish and Wildlife Services Refuges Program. The Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge, pictured here on the right, is in coastal South Carolina low country and is located just 23 miles northeast of Charleston, South Carolina. And the Cape Romaine Refuge is one of over 100 national wildlife refuges that have an urban designation, which is within, I believe, a 25-mile radius of an urban center. And like many other national wildlife refuges along the Atlantic seaboard, Cape Romaine faces impacts of sea level rise, coastal hurricane inundation, and urban growth. So the Southeast CASC researchers on this team engaged with stakeholders at the Cape Romaine Partnership for Coastal Conservation to explore sea level rise, inundation, and urban growth trends and forecasts. And the scientists and communities work together to identify management strategies to kind of balance South Carolina low country environmental wealth and rich cultural heritage and quality of life. So while this particular project didn't take place in an urban area, it's serving a largely urban population in its proximity to Charleston. I also wanted to touch upon some examples of urban climate adaptation strategies. So many cities have, although these are outdated, probably outdated examples, maybe they haven't been updated since, but these are some examples of climate action plans developed by a variety of different cities. They often include different climate adaptation strategies like multidisciplinary spatial planning. So bringing a variety, experts from a variety of different fields to the table to really begin to consider some of the climate impacts and spatial planning decisions that can be made to help mitigate those. In the context of adaptation for wildlife and habitats, conserving and managing species and habitats is another useful strategy in urban environments, as well as nature-based solutions, as I already mentioned, reducing non-climate stressors. Planned retreat is always on the table if climate impacts become too extreme. Some examples of nature-based solutions that can have benefits to urban wildlife and habitat include expanding marine habitat as a buffer for extreme storm events or sea level rise, which can also serve as additional habitat for wildlife, and expanding and preserving existing urban forest canopy, like is pictured on the right side, with really innovative strategies that can serve as habitat for wildlife, but also have co-benefits to urban residents. It's important to note that urban climate adaptation strategies like nature-based solutions can sometimes have unintended consequences. So this paper, published in July of 2022, on green gentrification in European and North American cities, describes that restoring degraded urban environments and creating green space or deploying climate adaptive green infrastructure can improve an area's attractiveness and also result in increasing property values, housing prices, which lead to the physical displacement of working class residents and often racialized groups. That ultimately serves as kind of a gentrifying force through this process known as green environmental or climate gentrification. And I mentioned this really to highlight the complexity of these challenges of urban climate adaptation in these environments, which really require multidisciplinary perspectives and teams, but also a very deep understanding of the local communities and the potential impacts that they are facing. And to get at some of the multidisciplinary perspectives and ideas that are happening across a variety of different federal agencies, the National Climate Adaptation Science Center is hosting an Urban Climate Adaptation Virtual Symposium on April 4th. The purpose of which is to showcase urban climate adaptation research, resource management, and partnerships that are happening across USGS and other federal agencies, and really discuss ways in which USGS science can better serve under-resourced urban and urban populations. So on this slide, I've just included some pictures of the planning team involved in the Urban Climate Adaptation Virtual Symposium. It has representation from both federal CASC staff as well as university consortium members. So Gabe Filippelli is a PI with the Midwest CASC. We also have representation from the Department of Interior. So Lisa Pelstring is the DOI lead for the Urban Waters Federal Partnership that I mentioned earlier. And Chrissy Hopkins is a USGS research hydrologist at the South Atlantic Water Science Center. And what's been really great working with this team is developing a great agenda, identifying speakers who are working at this intersection to speak to a variety of different topics related to urban climate adaptation. So the day will start with a welcome and kickoff. We'll have an opening keynote, and then our two main sessions focus on equitable partnerships in urban climate adaptation and emerging research highlights in urban climate impacts and adaptation strategies, which will be a really cool session on lightning talks from researchers that have just been awarded funding, so are at very early stages of their urban climate adaptation research projects. Following the main event will be a post-event discussion with facilitated breakout groups, and this has a separate limited registration. So we'll kind of discuss some of the themes that were carried through in the earlier sessions, but also can serve as kind of a standalone discussion to further explore urban climate impacts and strategies, and really be in a smaller group of many diverse perspectives to kind of think about the complexities of these issues. And with that, I'm going to wrap up so I can leave plenty of time for questions and further discussion. I'll drop the link to our Urban Climate Adaptation Virtual Symposium landing page in the chat, so people can kind of get an overview of the full scope of the event, explore some of the speaker bios, and also registration is at the bottom of that page. Welcome to take any questions.
Thank you, Mia. I don't know if Erica wants to. She always does a good job of moderating questions, but I can jump in as you get ready, Erica, and then I'll pass the baton to you. There was a question from Phil. First of all, I just want to thank you, Mia, for taking the time to compile such a beautiful presentation and share it with us. Very insightful on the work that's happening at the federal level. Phil asked the question in the chat, saying, thank you, Mia, for a great presentation. Tell us how you collaborate in urban research across the CASC network and how our 60 urban researchers might plug into the network. So
that is a really great question. And admittedly, this is kind of where the scope of my position and the knowledge of how the CASC program intricacies work. Considering the consortium model has existing university partners, to my understanding, those university partners can identify collaborators at other academic institutions. But really, I believe the lead PI on projects has typically have existing relationships within the CASC network, and through that kind of competitive process for selecting a variety of universities to participate in the consortium, my understanding is that kind of creates a more limited competitive process for applying for CASC funding. I can definitely ask my mentors and supervisors more specifically if there are ways for researchers outside of the consortium universities to collaborate, because really, yeah, that's the key piece, is making sure that the expertise out there that's well positioned to address these kind of questions are involved in that process. And I will add that the CASC definitely looks for projects that emphasize collaboration and co-production at a very high level. So working very closely with partners to identify on the ground needs, and valuing the trust building process for building those partnerships in order to address the needs of those partners.
Great, thank you. Erica, do you have a question, or does anybody else in the chat have any questions, or in the room? I haven't seen any others pop up, but you know, it's want to call people.
I do see
Yeah,
a comment in the chat about the urban research field stations, and I believe the Northeast CASC is already collaborating with the Northeast research station, and I'm not sure how. Getting a Teams call. I'm not sure exactly how that relationship has evolved over time, or whether other CASCs are exploring those options. And I see Kate has a hand up.
Yes, thank you. I can show you my face too. My name's Kate from the Philadelphia Parks and Recreation Tree Philly program. Just want to say thank you for the talk. It was really relevant to some things on my mind recently, trying to navigate a sort of like project I could call of a project of like climate adaptation and species migration we've been doing with our yard tree program. So planting some southern natives on private property. We're facing a stopping point now on that project for me, because we don't have the capacity to gather survivability data on the trees that we're planting. And it would definitely be a longer term project. Like I said, it's planted on private property, so it would involve a lot of outreach. We do some in parks, but that process of adding those species to our street tree list and our public plantings is a little bit more complicated. So we found this sort of avenue to do this sort of participatory planting project. So I think a next step for us is to try to find partners to help us gather that data. And we've really been trying to think of we're at the planning stage of building a timeline of trying to make those connections, and see if we can find like academic or other institutional partners to help us collect that information. And I'm just like, that was a big dump of where we're at. And just wondering if it feels like we're on the right path, or if you have any other recommendations for like immediate next steps or long-term ideas for how to like continue that project with like very limited public staff capacity, but a lot of interest in those staff members.
Yeah, that sounds like really impactful and really great work. Thanks for sharing, Katie, or Kate, is it? I would love to kind of punt your question to one of the Northeast CASC researchers to see how they might be able to build a proposal or collaborate with you in order to identify that kind of mission aligned space where that project could be supported by the CASC. I know that as I mentioned, the Forest Service field station is part of that consortium, but maybe one of the universities or even federal staff might be helpful in providing further guidance on that. I'm a bit more on the programmatic side, as opposed to, I wanted to highlight a bunch of the cool research that the CASC is doing, but it's very rare that I have a direct interaction with one of the PIs leading any of the projects. So that's kind of where the limit of my knowledge comes from on the research side of things. But I could at the least put you in touch with one of the CASC researchers or a CASC contact to help answer those questions.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that. I will email you.
Okay, my email's on the slide. Perfect.
So I
And
was gonna just, yeah, Mia, could you stop sharing your screen? Usually for
Sure.
the Q&A, we have everybody, thank you. And thanks, Phil, for putting that in there. And just to follow up, Kate, in Boston, we're forming the Boston Tree Alliance, where we actually are doing a very similar thing. It's private tree planting in collaboration with the city, but Mass Audubon is a nonprofit that responded to that request for proposals. And then my colleague is the community engagement coordinator, Amara Chittenden, is on the line hearing this. So Amara and Kate, maybe you have a connection there in the future. And the way that we're addressing the capacity is we're also interested in a similar thing, Mia. So if there are CASC researchers who are interested in helping with that survivability stuff. But I think you're on the right track, Kate, with, what university can help and what entity that's not a public agency could access and have those landowner agreements for access to land and data sharing. I think you're right on the right track, and it's really always exciting to kind of be following along with Philly up here in Boston. So great to hear. And I'd love to see if we could talk about our respective yard tree programs and just learn from each other if you have the time.
Definitely. Probably more in April, but let's be in touch, Erica. I'd really like that.
There is a question from Emily. What is the interaction between the CASCs and the NIACS climate hubs?
yeah, that's a great question. So can't remember the acronym for NIACS, if somebody remembers it and could drop it in the chat. But from my understanding, NIACS is mostly focused on tree and forestry specific interests. So there, I believe, has been some collaboration between the CASCs and NIACS, but we kind of like each kind of stay in their lane a bit. My interaction with NIACS more specifically on a project that I'm working on that's totally unrelated to any of the work that I shared today is focused on climate impacts to keystone native plants in the Mid-Atlantic region. So NIACS has prepared some climate assessments of trees in the Mid-Atlantic region, a lot across the US too. And we talked with them about kind of how they did those assessments and the types of projects and planting decisions being made at a more local level, kind of across the region, to get a better understanding of how people might be conceptualizing or the information that they're using to make plant selection decisions. That could be an entirely different talk for this audience. It doesn't have an explicitly urban focus, but it is focused on kind of plant selection decision making in the face of climate impacts. That's relevant to predominantly restoration community decision making, but could also be relevant to urban tree planting and urban resource management.
Great. And I'm seeing in the chat that folks are really interested in hearing about yard tree programs. So we'll keep that for a future UEC roundtable. I think that would be a great one. And I'm seeing a lot of support from other folks. Other questions from people for Mia? You can put them in the chat or you can unmute yourself, whatever you are curious about. Go ahead, Becky.
Thanks. I was just curious, Mia, from your side, if you foresee barriers to implementing your research, not just you, but all the other great research you just talked about that is coming down or has already happened. So and barriers to implementing research, and then also like one other like barrier that kind of impacts your work that you'd like to see taken away.
Yeah, that is a great question. Well, I am not a federal employee, but working or participating in a research program with a federal agency has exposed a lot of the red tape and process of federal governments and policy that in and of itself create barriers to direct collaboration with local communities. That's a pretty big one that I think also depending on how the research is framed, you know, at USGS as the science agency really wants to focus on the science questions, and how the agency defines science can be a bit prescriptive when the CASC program wants to promote this co-production model of relationship building and trust building. And not to say that those two things are mutually exclusive, because obviously the CASC program is funding a lot of successful co-production research, but it certainly creates a barrier in emphasizing some of the key components to the type of research that the program is looking for. I definitely feel like part of the process of being in an ORISE position is kind of identifying, you know, different career pathways, and there are so many really unique benefits to the federal resources that I have access to, and some of the information that I've gained through this fellowship. The ability to really have those sort of on the ground impacts that y'all, like when I joined the call this morning, Erica was like coming in from outside, and as an exclusively remote worker, the barrier of really having the direct involvement and impact with the folks that we're hoping benefit from the CASC research is one aspect of the program that I hope that I can kind of break down those barriers and identify other ways that I can collaborate more closely. I could probably list a long list, but also want to offer the reframe of like opportunities that we can consider ways to break down those barriers and make science more equitable and accessible by doing the challenging work of confronting the equity considerations in program delivery.
And don't worry, Mia, they don't let me outside too often. That would not be allowed. So today was a special Arbor Day planning, and I was only about 10 feet from the front door of the Boston Nature Center, which is in a CJEST and environmental justice kind of defined area by science. I'm just curious more from like a personal perspective, and in your career so far, Mia, like what has been the most rewarding part of your role on this project, and what recommendations or like light bulb moments do you have that you could share with the group? I always kind of like to throw in a little bit of the personal there. So yeah, any responses to that?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, Erica. A few things popped to my mind, which was I'm sure everyone on this call has a certain degree of environmental dread when thinking about climate change. And in some ways, thinking about climate change every day has, and thinking about the ways that the CASC program is addressing on the ground needs has been comforting and making it feel a little less overwhelming. Of course, it's like a huge challenge, and one program is not going to address all of the needs. But it has kind of helped me sort of come to terms with that dread and channel it in a more productive way. Another thing is just looking at climate projections and recognizing that most of the climate, the folks who work on climate modeling in the CASCs are like throwing out the 4.5 RCP models, and like we're on a track for these higher projections to pan out. also has helped me make decisions about what part of the country I'm going to live in. So there has like some very practical applications there. I'm based in Pittsburgh. Clara is my neighbor. Midwest projections, I mean, like, it's actually warming faster than most other areas of the country, but we still have that cooler climate buffer to begin with. So yeah, that's kind of a practical application. And also just kind of expanding on my research knowledge. Coming in, I had pretty limited knowledge about climate impacts and the way that climate change is operationalized in science. So learning a lot of skills like, what is a vulnerability assessment? What does it mean to assess vulnerability of different species or ecosystems or habitats in order to make more informed decisions has been really eye-opening.
Such a great answer, Mia. And I'm seeing a lot of support from your neighbor in the chat. And that's so cool that you guys live near each other. And what a great way to understand climate. I don't know if there's an answer for this question. I'm not expecting you to maybe have an answer for this question, but I'm also like a certified arborist, and I'm doing like arboriculture on the weekends. So I'm very curious about like, yeah, that operationalization and how people can really use climate change. A lot of species vulnerability assessments that I've seen have been done based on like climate modeling and species traits and characteristics coming from that science world, but not a lot of them have effectively, that I've seen, maybe they're out there and this group can connect me to them, but not a lot of them that I've seen have taken day-to-day arborists, what they're seeing with their street trees, like certain species falling apart, or, you know, we're saying that, you know, if we're saying that ash trees are supposed to fare better in terms of climate, well, not so much from an urban forester and arborist perspective. So do you have any comments on kind of that for our super tree people in the group?
That's a really great question. And part of what we're getting at with the climate impacts project that I'm working on, it is going to be vulnerability assessment based and consider some of the traits, but a great part of the process in developing that vulnerability assessment and kind of the needs of the audience is that we talked to a variety of different natural resource managers in the Mid-Atlantic region, mostly again that are focused on larger scale restoration, but also are working at, you know, the municipal scale or with private landowners. So we're hoping to take the results, like the goal would be to take the results from that vulnerability assessment and really operationalize it in a way that's usable to those audiences that we talk to, which would hopefully include, you know, practitioners like the folks on this call as well. One tool that I have seen that is really cool is it's based out of New York office. I'm trying to think of what it's called. It's a restoration tool where you can go in and kind of enter the type of habitat that you're hoping to restore to. It might include urban environments, and then based on the site conditions, it'll populate kind of like a climate adapted species list. And I am totally blanking on the name of it, but if I think of it, I'll definitely circulate it.
Yeah, send it out to us. And I'm just realizing we hit 11 o'clock without even noticing. We got so enthralled with what you were saying, Mia. Thank you so much for such a great presentation. And we will follow up with everybody through the Google group, and we'll send out all the links that people put in the chat and things that were discussed as follow-up resources. Thank you for attending the meeting to everyone who's here. And we look forward to seeing you next month for our UEC meeting. Thanks again, Mia.
Thanks all. Thanks for the discussion.